In this video, we will cover working with the TableView DataSource. The TableView DataSource will allow us to display our entries in our table view. It allows us to do this because it gives us access to two methods, number of rows in section and cell for row at. To be able to display this data inside of our table view that we have here, we have to implement the TableView DataSource. But before we can do that, we have to subclass the UI view controller and create an outlet to this table view. So in our UI folder, we will create a new Swift file, and we will call this entry list. Since we're going to subclass UI view controller, we want to import UIKit, create our entry list class, and subclass UI view controller. We will override our viewDidLoad and call superViewDidLoad. We will be doing some more functionality in this method shortly. But for now, let's create an outlet to our table view. We need an IV outlet var table view, which will be a UI table view. Then we can go to our entry list storyboard. We can subclass to our entry list, and then we can right click our entry list and drag our table view to the table view inside of our view controller. So we now have the outlet set up, and we can implement the UITableView DataSource. So the data we want to use to fill in our table view will come from our entry controller. In our entry controller, we are storing this var entries, which holds all the entries that we create within our app. So inside of our entry list, we first have to conform to the data source. So we can say extension entry list and conform to the UITableView DataSource. And the data source has two required methods that we have to implement. And you can see that type entry list does not conform to the protocol UITableView DataSource. So just like our keyboard scrollable protocol that we conform to, we had to implement those two methods for showing the keyboard and hiding the keyboard. We now have to do the same for the UITableView DataSource by implementing our cell for row at and our number of rows in section. So for now, the number of rows in section, we can return however many entries are in our entry controller. So we can say entry controller.shared.entries.count. If there are 0 entries, it will not display any cells, they would just be blank cells. But if there are entries, we need to tell it what to display. And that's what this cell for row at does. So we first have to create a cell. So we can say let cell equals our table view, which has a method called DQReusableCell. Since we're using prototype cells, we're using reusable cells, and we have to DQ them so that we can reuse them every time that we scroll, instead of creating completely new UITableView cells. And we have to use an identifier, which we made entry cell, and that is in our storyboard when we select the cell. In the attribute inspector, the identifier entry cell. And the index path is this property that is in the table view cell for row at index path. These two methods get called every time we reload the data. So table view has a method called reload data. So anytime that is called, it will call this number of rows in section and cell for row at methods. And that will get called when the table view is initialized initially. And then you can call it again whenever you need to. So now that we have the cell, we need to figure out what entry we want to display. So here we will say let entry equals the entry controller dot get entry, well dot shared, and then dot get entry, and we want to get it at a specific index path, and then we want to display the cell title or text label dot text and that will be equal to the entry.title, and the cell.detail text label.text will be equal to the entry.body. And then we can return the cell. But one thing to note is we're not dealing with tags right now, and in our entry controller, when we get the entry index path, we were actually getting them based off the tags. So we will comment out these two lines here because we just care about all of the entries right now. When we go into sections, we will care about the tags and the entry. But for now, let's just care about the entries. And going back to the entry list, we're getting the specific entry at a specific index, and then we're displaying the title and the body. In order to test this out, we now have to go back to our project settings by clicking Journal with the blue icon and changing our main interface from Create Entry to our entry list. And that will bring us to the entry list storyboard at our initial view controller point, which is the navigation controller. So now when we run it, it's just going to show us an empty table view because we haven't created any entries yet. So notice it's an empty table view. So instead of having an empty table view, we can create some mock data. To create some mock data, we will go over to our entry controller and we will implement an initializer. And in this initializer, we will set our entries to some random data. So we can say let entry, or say entry1 equals an entry, and we will give it a title of my first entry with a body, this is my first entry. The tag, we will just give this journal and a color of .light. Now we will copy this a couple times for a total of 4 entries. Change the numbers to 2, 3, and 4. And here we can say another entry. And here we can say yet another entry. And we will say one more entry. Here is another entry for my journal. The body for another entry in my journal. And here we will say this is the last entry for my journal for today. So now we have to set entries equal to the entries we just created. So we will do an open and close bracket because it's an array, and we will put entry 1, entry 2, entry 3, and entry 4. So now once we call the entry controller.shared.entries, it will see this entries as an empty array, but when it initializes the entry controller, it will set that entries equal to these 4 entries that we created. There's still one more thing that we have to do before this will actually work in our app. We have to go back to our entry list, and here we are conforming to this UITableView DataSource, but we're actually never setting the data source. So in our view.did_load, we have to say tableview.dataSource equals self. What we are doing here is we are assigning self, which is this entry list, to the TableView DataSource. And the TableView DataSource is actually a type of UITableView DataSource. So our entry list here is conforming to the UITableView DataSource. So that means our entry list can be represented as a UITableView DataSource. Therefore, self is a UITableView DataSource and can be assigned to the tableview.dataSource. Now when we run the app again, we will see those 4 entries that we created inside of our table view. My first entry, another entry, yet another entry, and one more entry. In the next video, we will cover implementing sections in a UI table view. See you then.